Tzedek told him to go to the mikveh. That's the story. Push him to the mikveh. And one of the stories which is told, this story, I don't know how true it is, but it's certainly a compelling story, was she's coming back from the mikveh and there was a man following her. So she freaked out. She started running. She came running into the house. The Tzedek says, what are you so nervous about? There's a guy following me. So the Tzemach Tzedek says that is Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet, from the time of David HaMelech, he said. And the Rebbe Maharash was born. He was born today in 1834. Tov Kuf Tzadik Dalet. His birth was 6 years after the passing of the second Lubavitcher Rebbe. The middle Rebbe's name was Rebbe Ben. And all the Hasidim were certain that this young boy's name is going to be Beryl. Tzemach Tzedek was the middle Rebbe's son-in-law. Tzemach Tzedek was the middle Rebbe's successor. He was only a Rebbe for 6 years. And everybody was certain that this little boy's name is going to be Rebbe Ben after his father, after Zayden, the middle Rebbe. It's not common for Rebbes to have children, because usually you become a Rebbe when you're a little bit older. It didn't happen often that the Rebbes had babies, and when they had babies, Chassidim came to participate. There were hundreds of people at the Rebbe Maharash bris, possibly thousands, and they fed them all. The family, they had a big kitchen and a bunch of people. They cooked and they fed. They didn't have catering. They fed all the Chassidim. The morning of the bris, the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek comes out of his room. And by the way, when the Rebbe Maharash was born, the Tzemach Tzedek stood in the room where the baby was being delivered, facing the wall. And he told all of his children to stay in a different room, and he gave them a list of kapitlich tilm, of psalms that they should recite during the time of the delivery and the birth of the Rebbe Maharash. The morning of the bris, the Tzemach Tzedek comes out of his room and he announces, the bris will be today, and he goes back to his room. It was a very strange kind of an announcement. Of course, the bris is going to be today. He disappears into his room and he waits a couple of hours. Now it's probably 10 o'clock in the morning, which in Russia in those days was like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Today it was like really late. And he walks out of his room and says, the bris will be today. And goes back to repeat yourself 3 or 4 times. So try to imagine hundreds and hundreds of people sitting at tables laden with food and you're not allowed to touch it. Why? You're not supposed to eat for the bris. And they're waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting and they're schmoozing. How much can you schmooze? And amongst the people sitting there was some very important Hasidim. Some of them were great rabbis. Some of them were even holy people. Tzemach Tzedek had many sons who would later become Rebbes in their own right, and they're all sitting around and they're waiting for the bris. One of the members of that assemblage was an elderly Jew whose name was Chaim Avram. He was the Alter Rebbe's son. He was the Tzemach Tzedek's uncle. He was probably then in his 70s. He was a man of few words. He was a great man. He was a holy man, brilliant man, but he didn't speak a lot. He was part of the Lubavitch furniture. He came to Lubavitch. There were holy people you could just watch. He was one of them. He never held a public position. He was a tzaddik. And he was sitting there, and the Tzemach Tzedek's children, who were his great nephews, were all trying to figure out what's the delay. Chaim Avram is listening to them talk back and forth, so finally he interjects. And in his typical style says one sentence, is fanumen mit shene de krum faruns, and he sighs, which means in English, he's busy with finer guests than we are. That was all he said. And he sighed to indicate frustration that the Tzemach Tzedek was probably visited by the Alter Rebbe, he was busy with holy souls from the other world. But this goes on all day till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Every couple of hours, comes out of his room, he says, the bris will be today. So at one point, it was decided by I don't know whom, we're going to eat. By the time the bris happened, there was no food. They ate. They said l'chaim. They got probably said, some of them probably were a little bit inebriated. They ate the food of the bris before. How are you going to wait? Anyway, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Tzemach Tzedek goes out of his room and he goes to see his wife, the Rebbe Simchai Mushka, who had just delivered a baby, to discuss the naming of this little boy. Comes to the bris. The Tzemach Tzedek did all the services. He held the baby during the bris. Then he gave the baby a name. V'Kodesh maybe Yisrael Shmuel. There is no name in Chabad. Shmuel doesn't exist. We're a small land. And it was a complete surprise. Nobody had the slightest idea. Everyone expected Rebbe. It was a logical name to give. Shmuel. Anyway, the bris happened. The baby was taken away and they sat down to eat. Tzemach Tzedek watched. And they were sitting at the Sudas Bris. And finally, somebody mustered up the courage to say to the Tzemach Tzedek, now, where do you find this name? Shmuel. In our family, you don't have a Shmuel. So the Tzemach Tzedek said, he's named after a water carrier in Polotsk. Polotsk is a city in Russia. And there was a water carrier in Polotsk who the Tzemach Tzedek said was a hidden tzaddik who knew the whole Torah by heart, Bavli and Yerushalmi. And he died that day. The Tzemach Tzedek was not getting emails or faxes or texts or beeps. Tzemach Tzedek knew how the Tzemach Tzedek knows that this water carrier died, and Tzemach Tzedek decided to name his son after this man, who nobody knew. There was a problem. You're not allowed to name someone after a deceased person until they're buried. And the Levaya was being delayed. There was another man in Polotsk who died, who was rich and famous. So they made a big funeral. They made eulogies, went on all day long. At 3:00 in the afternoon, when the other funeral was finished, they got together 10 Jews. They went to the Kabranov Shtibel, to the house, the shul, where the undertakers hung around. And by the way, undertakers, for those who do not know, in the 19th century in Russia were all alcoholics, because it was the only way you could be around dead bodies. They didn't have refrigerators. And they prepared this water carrier for his final journey. They dug a grave, they buried him. Tzemach Tzedek was aware of this through his means, through Ruchnistic means. And as soon as he was buried, he made the bris. That's the whole story. And then people understood. During the bris, as the Tzemach Tzedek was naming his son Shmuel, the people very close heard the Tzemach Tzedek mumble something. He said something under his breath. But at the time, it didn't make any sense. But later, when he explained it, they understood. They heard him mutter. In Yiddish, he said, "The Chevra Kedishim of Polotsk, taka heilige Chevra, aber afoyle Chevra." In Hebrew, it goes better because in Hebrew, it's more precise. He says, the undertakers of Polotsk, they're maybe a holy society, but they're so lazy because he was waiting for this man to be buried. This was the Rebbe Maharash. The Maharash was a wunderkind. He was an extraordinary child. He was raised together with all his nephews. His nephews were 3 years older than him, 4 years older than him, 2 years older than him. They all sat in the same cheder. They were very intelligent children. But next to their young uncle, they were simple. He was just extremely intelligent, unbelievably smart. In addition, he was very precocious. Some of the Chabad Rebbes, including our Rebbe, were introverts. Even as little kids, they didn't hang around. The Rebbe Maharash was incredibly easy to befriend. He loved himself. He was very comfortable with himself. And he would be 5, 6, 7 years old. He'd sit in a fabrengen of adult chassidim and participate. He was just cool. He was on the ball. He was very, very unshy, if I may use that expression. And his nephews were so jealous of him. When the chassidim would dance, these little kids, 5-year-olds, they were shnersons, they were some grandchildren. They would stand and watch and wish they could join in. And as soon as the Rebbe Maharash would walk into the room, he'd immediately run into the circle, and within 30 seconds, some chassid swept him off his feet and put him on his shoulders. That's the kind of a child he was. He was incredibly self-assured, very confident, very happy, very open, very free. And he made lots and lots of friends. Lubavitch was a hub. Lubavitch was a tiny little hole in the wall. Then it was a metropolis. Thousands of people visited Lubavitch every year to come to the Rebbe. And everybody who passed through Lubavitch found a few minutes to hang out with, quote, the Rebbe's Muzinik, the Rebbe's youngest son. They schmoozed with him. He was just a great conversation. And people wanted to be his friend. And he used to bring him gifts. The Rebbe Maharash as a child had some hobbies that later as a Rebbe he continued for health reasons. Amongst his hobbies was that he would do sculpture. He did very, very fine artwork. Very, very fine. I mean, I'm not a maven in this, and I've never seen it, but that's what they say. I've never met them, but they say that the Rebbe Maharash did very fine artwork. I'm just going to tell you something which may come as a surprise to you. If you ever go into the Rebbe's room, which is possible, if you go into the Rebbe's room, at the far end of the room, there's a desk, correct? Hello? Have you been in the Rebbe's room? Yeah. So if you haven't, you should make an appointment, go and say Kapitel Tilim. To the left of the Rebbe's desk, there's a table that's round. It's a round table covered with a a tablecloth that comes almost down to the floor and then a plastic on top of it. That table was made by the Rebbe Maharash himself. He made, as a Rebbe, he used to do crafts. He used to do woodwork and he worked with plaster for dexterity. He had a lot of illnesses and he suffered from sensory deficiencies. They were afraid he would lose his feel. So doctors told that he should do this. And he did many things. Among the things that he did as a Rebbe was he became a sefer. He prepared cloth, parchment, and he wrote 6 Megillas. He had 6 children. He gave each one of his children a Megillas Esther that he wrote himself. Some of those Megillas are extant. We know where they are. And he did, as a child, it was a hobby. So the story, of course, was that he had these little tools, and whatever he would do, he would find a piece of wood, he would scrape something out of it, and he was very good. He was very good at it. So with a chassid who traveled for business to some market, and he found a very, very sophisticated tool for people who did this handcrafting kind of work. So he bought it. And he came to Lubavitch, and he found his way to the Rebbe Maharash. They called the Rebbe's Muzinik. He was 7 or 8 years old. And he brings him this big, hefty little tool, and he opens up all the different blades. I mean, no one has pocket knives anymore. We were kids, we had pocket knives. People still have pocket knives. It was people still have pocket knives. It was a big deal. They would pocket with another blade and another blade and another. It was such a waste of time and money. But this is what we did. I don't think I ever owned one, by the way, but all my friends did, and I was very jealous of them. And his chassid goes over to the Rebbe Maharash, and he shows him all of the different gadgets that you could use to carve. And he says to the Rebbe Maharash, I was in this place. I saw it at a fair, and I bought it for you. It's yours. If you can answer one question, where is God? So the Rebbe Maharash puts his hand in his pocket, and he pulls out his knife, which was far deficient, it had many fewer blades, and he opens it up, and he's showing it to this guy, and says, and you can have this if you can tell me where he's not. That's the story. That's the story, the Rebbe Maharash. He was a troublemaker. The Rebbe Maharash was a troublemaker. He was a troublemaker. He sat in the back of the room. He was the youngest kid in the class. He was 6, they were 9 and 10. And he was brighter than all of them. He just had an incredible mind. And understand, the fellow students in the class were themselves geniuses. But he was in a different class. And he was always playing with something. His favorite hobby was to take mechanical devices apart and put them back together. You know, those days they didn't really have electromagnetism. You're talking now the 1830s and 40s. So everything was mechanical, right? They already had a wind-up watch, maybe it was. So he had a pocket watch, which you had to wind it with gears and springs, the whole situation. He would take it apart bit by bit. I knew how to do that as a kid, yeah. But he would also put it back together. And I always get into trouble. Putting it back together, I always get stuck. This is what he did. He sat in the back of the room, kept himself occupied. And every once in a while, he'd pop up and make a comment. And usually he was right on, and he was making fun of somebody because they were so dumb as far as he was concerned. And he was just, you could not like him. But his friends in school were not happy about it. One day the teacher asks a question, and the Rebbe Maharash says, I know the answer, but I'm not telling it because everybody around here is not smart. He used a different word for not smart. And so his nephew, who would grow up to be a very big Rebbe, a much bigger Rebbe than he, a large following, was 10. The Rebbe Maharash was 6 or 7. And his uncle's making fun of him. And the teacher didn't stand up for him. So the next day he came to school with his father. So the Rebbe Maharash is 7. His older brother, who's like 34, shows up in class to complain to the teacher, how come the teacher is favoring his brother over his son? And he comes into the classroom and he complains to the teacher. And the Rebbe Maharash is sitting in the back of the room playing with his pocket watch, taking it apart, putting it back together. And his brother's complaining to the teacher. And the Rebbe Maharash is heard to say from the back of the room, Azevi sagt Rebbe Zion de Balagola. Was größer der hinten als mehr Pferd. It's very hard to translate this in English without it coming across perverse. He says, like the wagon drive of Lubavitch, whose name Ben Zion says, the bigger the behind, the more horse. It was just in other words, yes, he's bigger than me. Yeah? So what? So he's bigger than me, but that doesn't make him more than me. So the Maril, his older brother, turns to his younger brother, who's a 7-year-old. He says, oh, and asponim, you're a chutzpanyak. So the Rebbe Maharash says to his older brother, again, it doesn't go over in translation, but there is an approach in the Gemara that every time you have the word es, the word es is always extra, you don't need it. So you have to learn something from it. So from kabit es avicha vesimecha, you learn that you have to not only honor your older brother, your father and your mother, you have to honor your older brothers and sisters. So the Maril is saying, excuse me, young man, I'm 4 times your age, or 5, you happen to be my brother, but I'm a little older than you. So the Rebbe Maharash answers him, you're quoting the S of kabit es avicha vesimecha, but you forgot about the S of es Hashem l'kachatira. You're supposed to fear God. It says Es Hashem l'kachatira. The word S is extra. The Gemara learns that you have to have respect for Talmidei Chachamim. The Barash is 7. His brother is 35. He tells me you have to have derech eretz. I'm a bigger Talmid Chacham than you. And it may have been true. If it wasn't true then, it was going to be true later. This was the kind of child he was. He made trouble. Had a lot of fun. But he was at the same time brilliant, of course, but he's also very holy. And he was a secret. The Rebbe Maharash was a mystery. No one knew anything about him. He talked about anything in the world, but things that were meaningful. And you had to really know him to appreciate that there was a mass. There was behind us, there was somebody special. The Tzemach Tzedek had 7 sons. Each of his sons was a giant. And each of his sons was skilled in one area. The Tzemach Tzedek would say about his sons, this is my Talmudic scholar, this is my halachic rabbi, this is my expert in Hasidus, each one of them had a label. The Rebbe Maharash was so late to the game, he didn't have a label. So Chassidim were once sitting around, talking to this same older brother who he had this altercation in class with. And they said to him, to the Maril, they said, your father said about this one that he's this and this one. What about the youngest, Reb Shmuel, the Rebbe Maharash, who acted like a businessman? And the Maril responded, the youngest, he has what each of us has. Kulu isnu bey, whatever we have, he has. And people did not know it because he was incredibly secretive. Okay, I have a limited amount of time, so I'll share with you some important stories. One of them is the following. He was married twice. The Master was married twice. He got married in 1848. He was 14 years old. He married a niece to his brother's daughter. She lasted 3 months. They got married. As soon as Sheva Brachas was over, he got sick. She got sick. She passed away 3 months later. And the Rebbe Maharash, notwithstanding his unbelievable character, was absolutely shattered. He was unconsolable. He was so broken. He was so upset. His father, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, who was a big Rebbe, had one wish. His wish was that all of his children should live in Lubavitch. He wanted his children to be around him. He didn't even mind if they opened up different shops, if there be more than one Hasidus, but he wanted everybody to be in Lubavitch. He wanted to be near him. And most of them stayed in Lubavitch till he passed away. Once he passed away and the politics started, with the Chassidim, one by one they left, the Rebbe Maharash stayed. So when each one of his sons got married, and the average age of marriage in Rebbe's families in those days was 14 or 15 years old, the Tzemach Tzedek would build each one of them a house and a shul adjacent to each other on one of the streets of the great metropolis of Lubavitch, which is, I don't know, from here to Montgomery Street. I was in Lubavitch. You can walk it in 15 minutes. It's tiny. But on each one of his sons, he built him a house and a shul. And when Chassidim would come to Lubavitch to see the Rebbe, each Chassid had a favorite son, as it were. So you came to see the Tzemach Tzedek, and then you would go to, this in the street where such and such a son of the Tzemach Tzedek had his own little court, and you would schmooze with him also. So when the Rebbe Maharash got married, he did the same thing. He built him a house and a shul. And then the Rebbe Maharash lost his wife, and he was unconsolable. He was so devastated. He could not be quieted. So the Tzemach Tzedek built an extension to his own home. He built it into his own home, and he moved his son in. So they lived together. 2 years later, he remarried, but that arrangement remained. So Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Maharash lived together in the same house. The result of this was that his children, that means the Tzemach Tzedek's grandchildren, although they were the youngest of the grandchildren by far, knew their Zayda the best. They lived in the same house. When he got married a second time, whom did he marry? He married the Rebbetzin Rivki. She's probably the most famous of all the Chabad Rebbetzins. She had great longevity. Her husband passed away at 47. She lived into her 80s. She died in 1914. She passed away in 1914. Her Yotat is actually Yud Shvat. She has the same Yotat as her grandson, the Friedrich Rebbe, Rebbetzin Rivki. Her story is also very interesting. And by the way, I want to make an announcement, girls. About 25 years ago, Chabad published a book called Harabonis Rivka. It's a biography about this Rebbetzin Rivka, written by the previous Rebbe after she passed away. He wrote it in 1915. And one of the girls, one of our students from Machon Chana, whose name I'm never going to remember, but I'll see her, I'll recognize her face, translated it into English. You should get it and read it. It's interesting. Rebbetzin Rivka, 100 pages. There's probably one of it in the library here. It's interesting. It's an interesting read. She had a sister named Gittel. Their parents were holy people. There's no way to put it. They were holy people. Her father's name was Adon Alexanderov. He was the son of a great chassid, the grandson of a great chassid, and so on. And their mother was the youngest daughter of the Mittler Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe had many daughters. Tzemach Tzedek had many sons. The Mittler Rebbe had many daughters. The oldest daughter was Sarah, and the youngest daughter was Sarah. The Mittler Rebbe had a daughter. She grew up, got married, had children, and died. And he had time to have another daughter by the same name. I mean, that gives you an idea. This Rebbetzin Rivka, which is the Gittel, were the daughters of the second Sarah. Their childhood was unbelievably special. Their parents were holy people. There was an enormous amount of peace in their home and love. And I don't know how, but there was money around. They were not poor. And then they died, both of them, the father and the mother. By the time that Rebbetzin Rivka was 11, she was an orphan from both sides. Originally, she was raised by her paternal grandmother. That didn't work out so well. So her maternal grandmother, the Mittler Rebbe's wife, who was still alive and living in Lubavitch, whose name was Shana or Shandel, adopted them. She raised them. When the Rebbe Maharash came to marriageable age, she felt, she was the Tzemach Tzedek's mother-in-law, that she didn't have a right to interfere. You know, a boy is getting married. He doesn't have to marry a cousin because she's an orphan. It's a rachmanis on her, you know. He can choose a shidduch. But then the wife died. She passed away. So the Rebbetzin Rivka, so the Rebbetzin Shana came to her son-in-law, to the Tzemach Tzedek, and said, listen, you have a bacharel? I didn't say a word. He lost his wife. Now we're talking about a second marriage. Take one of my granddaughters. They're living in Lubavitch. They were special girls. Choose one. So the Tzemach Tzedek says to his mother-in-law, this relationship was very interesting. Very interesting. And by the way, Tzemach Tzedek's relationship with his wife was also interesting. The Mittler Rebbe's wife was incredibly outspoken. She was sharp as a razor. And she never held a secret. Whatever she felt, she said. She had 7 daughters, all in her image. They were incredibly powerful women. Powerful women. You know how powerful they were? When the Mittler Rebbe was arrested, one of his daughters acted as his lawyer. Until she realized that the judge loved looking at her. There was something about her. And he was prolonging the case. He was dragging it out because he like the guy. He was looking at her. And so she stopped. She sent somebody in her place, and then very quickly the thing was resolved. Very incredible women. So she comes to his son-in-law, to the Tzemach Tzedek, and says, you got to take one of my granddaughters. So Tzemach Tzedek was a tough negotiator. He says to his mother-in-law, okay, what are you offering me? You know, in those days in Eastern Europe, in America, it's different. Everything is different. But in those days, when you got married, you gave a dowry. If you couldn't get a dowry, you didn't get a husband. Someone's offering me 28,000 ruble from Dubrovna. 28,000 ruble in the 1840s. It probably was 1850. Was an awful lot of geld. I don't know how much it was, but it was a lot of money. Someone's offered me 28,000 ruble for dowry for the Rebbe Maharash, for the shidduch. What can you offer me? So she said, I have no money. But I'll tell you what. I was married to the Mittler Rebbe for 40 years. I was married to a Rebbe for 40 years. So the expression is Eishet halacha. It's a Mishnah, it's a Gemara, it's a halacha. Eishet chaver kechaver. A wife of a Rebbe is a Rebbe. I'll give him my 40 years of being the wife of the Mittler Rebbe. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, okay. And then the girls came into his room, the 2 of them. And the Tzemach Tzedek wanted the younger one. The Rebbe Tzedek was the younger of the 2. But he didn't want to say it because he didn't want to embarrass the older sister. I mean, how old were they? One was 14, one was 16. And Gittel realized, the older sister understood what's not being said, so she said to Rivka, go, I will hold no grudge. And the Tzemach Tzedek promised her a shidduch. Tzemach Tzedek made her a very fine shidduch. But the Rebbe Tzedek married the Rebbe Maharash. So the way she would tell her own story, and you can read it in this biography, she says, my childhood was unbelievably peaceful. But my early adolescence, from the time she was probably 10 or 11 until she got married, the only thing I had in the world was my sister. She just couldn't find a place for themselves. They were raised by the nicest people, but they felt invaded. They didn't feel the sense of security and embrace that they felt in their own home. They was never duplicated by neither of their grandmothers. And the Rebbe Maharash, this is such an interesting piece of Lubavitch history. The Rebbe Maharash understood this. He was all of 16. She may have been a year older. I mean, when kids get married at 14, 15 years old, sometimes the girl's a year older. My grandmother told me that her grandmother told her that when she got married, that means my grandmother, her husband would go outside and play with the kids. It was 14-year-old boychko. And she would go outside and said, come here and take care of the baby. He was a boy. He was a little boy there, little kids. My grandmother told me about her grandmother that she would scream at her husband. She was 2 years older than him. She was the grand old age of 17. And he was 14. He was playing in the sandbox. Come here. And he would listen to her. Anyway, the Rebbe Maharash was very aware of the fact that his wife had not had the full experience of being raised. So he didn't leave her with the household duties. He partnered with her. She said, I did everything together. They shopped together. They raised the children together. They talked about education together. They balanced their books together. They were of the Chabad Rebbes is the perfect couple. He was not yet the Rebbe, understand. She would say later, when I married my husband, first of all, her life became again the way it had been before her parents had passed, in terms of how she felt about living. She said, the Rebbe was my teacher. She taught him how to be a mother. He taught her how to be a mother, how to date. And there were 6 kids in that house. And let's just say they were not the easiest kids. And the Rebbe Tzedek told the Frierdiker Rebbe, who recorded her grandson, who recorded this biography, there were 6 kids in the house and nobody ever shouted. Nobody ever raised their voice. Can you imagine? Imagine. This was the kind of house that they created. And she says that it was only, she says, I could not have done it because she didn't have the skill. The Rebbe Maharash understood what his wife needed, and they did everything together. Their relationship is one of the sweetest stories you'll ever hear. The Rebbe Maharash was rich, very rich, for a while. When he passed away, there was no 2 dimes to get the nickels together, but for a while he was very, very wealthy. How was he wealthy? This is an interesting story. He would buy lottery tickets, government lotteries. And he won lots of money, more than once or twice. Now, to win the lottery once is amazing. To win it more than once is impossible. The Tzemach Tzedek also used to buy lottery tickets. And they found Pidyonis, where the Tzemach Tzedek prayed, daven to the Eibishter, that his son should win. The Rebbe Maharash, before he was Rebbe, and even the early years of his Nesias, had lived in luxury, materially in luxury. And it's understood that there was something spiritual about it. It wasn't just that he could afford it. There was something. He would travel all over Europe and buy the most expensive furniture, the most expensive windows, the most expensive doors and door frames, and ship them to Lubavitch. Lubavitch didn't have a train station; you had to carry it basically. And he lived in a shtetl where the people were living in abject poverty in a completely different level. There was something spiritual about it. The Maharash. Anyway, he was always buying his wife jewelry. She had no use for it. I mean, she was wearing jewelry that princesses wore in a community where nobody had a ring. It's only useful if everyone's got nice jewelry and you got nicer jewelry. She never used it, and she didn't mean anything to her. But every time he traveled, and he traveled often, he'd buy her a very expensive piece of jewelry. He'd bring it to her as a gift. She took the jewelry and pawned it, took the money and gave it to Tzedakah. On every return trip, he went to the pawn shop and redeemed all of her jewelry, paid for it, and brought the jewelry to her. The next day, she took all the jewelry plus the new piece back to the pawn shop. She got money and she gave to Tzedakah. Now, what would have happened if she kept the jewelry in the box and he gave her money? This was the way they lived for many, many years. He bought her jewelry. She never used it. She never wore it. Her husband has to buy his wife jewelry. And that's how they lived. This is the kind of relationship they had. The mutual respect between the two of them, was really extraordinary. it was such a derech. The way he looked at her, the way she looked at him, is famous within the inner circles of the Chabad world. There was an incredible amount of derech between the two of them. And then, of course, the Rebbe Maharash would eventually become a Rebbe. So this is one story that I wanted to share, the story about his marriage. The second story is at the age of 18, he began to travel. Most children of Rebbes at the age of 18 years old are married with a wife and a couple of kids, but they spend 18 hours a day in books. They don't go anyplace. You have to understand the Eastern European world amongst elite Jews. I'm sorry for using that word, but that's the right word. They got married very, very young. A boy and a girl get married at 14, 15. They're not ready to raise a home. So they lived in their parents' home. The grandmother raised the first few children until the parents grew up, and then they would find themselves a house and start a life. But for all those early years of their marriage, their parents were raising their children, raising them, and they were sitting and learning. For a boy from a Rebbe's family to begin to travel all over Europe at the age of 18, it was very, very young, and it was also very rebellious. It didn't look good. It looked like he was a troublemaker. He dressed by the standards of Chabad in those days modern. He wore a jacket and a hat, but compared to how his brothers were dressed, he was dressed like a businessman. He would disappear for weeks at a time. He was all over Europe. He was in Germany. He was in France. I don't think he was in England, but he was in every country. He was in Belgium. He visited. Whatever he was doing. And his excuse was he's traveling for business. Everyone knew he had a lot of money, but he wasn't traveling for business. He was traveling for tzaddis. He was traveling on behalf of his father. Tzemach Tzedek took his 18-year-old son and said, "You're going to be my eyes and ears." He traveled all over Russia. And whenever he came back, he made sure everybody knew about his escapades and about his business and the people that he met. And it was all a cover. And people saw him as the black sheep of the family. You have 9 kids. One of them is going to be a failure. Everybody knew that he was very intelligent. Everybody knew he spoke multiple languages. Everybody knew that he was incredibly well-read in all areas. And he was also a big Talmid Chacham. But he was too modern for their liking, you understand? He didn't exactly fit the bill of an Eastern European son of a Hasidic Rebbe. And one of the most famous stories, which is a story that I want to share, is that on one of these trips, and he traveled he didn't have a lot of tzaddas, and he traveled and he met people, government people, Jewish leaders, and he did what he could to help the Jewish people. He was his father's liaison. He traveled for his father. On one of his many trips, he was in Galicia, and he passed through the city of Belz. The first of the great Belz Rebbes. I don't know how much you know about the Hasidic dynasty of Belz. I mean, you're Nebuch and Lubavitch, so you're brainwashed and closed-minded, yeah. But there's a lot of wonderful Jews outside these walls. The Belz Rebbes, and there were 4 of them. The current Belz Rebbe is the 5th Belz Rebbe. He's the nephew of the Rebbe before. The Belz Rebbes were unbelievably holy men, incredibly holy men, and they were also very great leaders. For whatever reasons, most of them or all of them had trouble with their eyes. They're all blind at the end of their lives. The first Belz Rav, Reb Shalom Belz, Reb Sar Shalom Belz, very, very famous rabbi. He also passed away around 1865. He was the Rebbe in Belz. He built a shul. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, you know that the largest shul in Jerusalem is the Belzer Shul. The Belzer Shul in Jerusalem is modeled after the Belzer Shul in the Shtet of the Belz, because the Shalom Belzer built a shul to be modeled after the Beis Hamikdash. So his nephew, his great-great-grandson built a shul in the image of the Belzer Shtibel in Belz. Reb Shalom Belzer was blind. So he walked into the shul, and under each arm, one of his servants were holding him to steer him in the right direction. The Rebbe Maharash walks in. The Rebbe Maharash did not look like Galician Hasidim. He looked like a Russian Chassid. Moreover, he looked like a modern Russian Chassid, like a businessman, like a Sheicher. Nobody thought twice of who he was. The guy came into the shul, okay. As soon as the Belz Rebbe walks into the room, he shakes off his support, and he makes a beeline for the Rebbe Maharash, going straight at him. The Rebbe Maharash realizes, the Belz Rebbe realizes who he is, and he starts making a dash for the door. But the Belz Hasidim didn't let him leave. The Belz Rebbe grabs him. "Who are you?" So the Chassidim around say to the Belz Rebbe, "He's a businessman. He's a nobody. He's not a chassid. He's not a tzaddik. He's a businessman." So the Belz Rebbe, who you couldn't fool, says, "Yeah, He's a businessman. He quotes the pasuk, Ki toiv sachar mikol schayra. Torah is the best wares, the best merchandise is the Torah. He knew who the Rebbe Maharash was. So of course the Rebbe Maharash told him he's the son of the Tzemach Tzedek. He brought him up onto the dais together with him, and the Belzerov made the Lubavitcher Rebbe give shirayim. That means the leftover food to all the Belzer Hasidim. In other Hasidic groups, giving shirayim is a big part of the Hasidus. Chabad doesn't believe in shirayim, but the Belzerov made he came back to Lubavitch. You couldn't believe it. How did this blind man snuff him out? And the Tzemach Tzedek said to his son, the Rebbe Maharash, how are you thinking from a man who has such clear Ruach HaKodesh? How did you think to hide? Now, this story is interesting, but what's so interesting is the exact same story repeats itself 4 generations later. His great-grandson, the Belzer, was of Adol Belzer, the Holy Belzer Rebbe. He may have been the greatest of the Belzer Rebbe. The Holy Rebbe is very famous. Adol Belzer passed away in 1957. The Rebbe met him in Berlin. And I think he also may have met him a second time in Perkersdorf, which is a resort area near Vienna, which is in Austria. The Belzerov came to Berlin to see doctors because he was suffering with his eyes. The Rebbe was living in Berlin, was going to school, took a friend to see the Belzerov. The Holy Rebbe Rabban Belz. The Belzerov had the tradition of other Hasidic groups, again, not a Chabad tradition, to give shalom. All the Chassidim would line up and everyone has to shake the Rebbe's hand. But the Belzer Rebbe didn't want to shake people's hands, so he was holding a kerchief like this, a shmata dazoi. It was wrapped around his hand, and I could just see it. If you look at the photos of the Belzer Rebbe, his head was down. It looked like he's asleep. And you would walk by and you would shake the towel and move on. He didn't want people to touch his hand. Shake the towel and walk by. So he's like this, right? And one by one, they're fighting. By hundreds of people. And finally comes the Rebbe's turn. The Rebbe had a beard, but the Rebbe was probably not 30 when this story happened. And he was dressed quite modern. As soon as the Rebbe walks on the Belzer, picks up his eyes, takes a look at him, takes off his towel, shakes the Rebbe's hand, puts the towel back on and goes back to sleep. They didn't exchange a word. The Rebbe walked up to the Belzer, he opens up his eyes, he looks like he's asleep, yeah? Takes a look at him, takes off the towel, shakes his hand, puts the towel back on and goes to sleep. That's it, that's the whole meeting. 20 years later, the Frierdiker passes away, I'm finishing. The Rebbe becomes a Rebbe, and he sends a letter to all the Rebbes in the world. He sends a letter to all the Rebbes in the world that they should celebrate the schism. It was before the Rebbe was actually officially Rebbe. And such a letter arrived to the Holy Belzer. The Holy Belzer was 70. He was the same age as the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe was a brand new Rebbe. So the Belzer secretary is laughing that a young new Rebbe from America is sending the Belzer Rebbe a letter with instructions that he should make a fabrengen to Skisef. So he comes to the Holy Belzer and he's fun, he's laughing. You hear this young new Rebbe from America is giving the Rebbe instructions. And the Belzer didn't laugh at all. I heard 2 different versions to the story. The story I heard from Rabbi Nachman Twersky was, Nein, von the greatest Rebbes. No. This is one of the greatest Rebbes. The Rebbe wasn't even officially Rebbe yet. They never exchanged a word. They shook hands. Okay, go eat lunch. L'chaim. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, Rivka, it's so nice to have you.
Thank you.
You're not going to tell me what you're doing in one tea.
I'm so nervous.
That I understand.
Yeah.
The Sheikh Chabad, you'll do amazing.